Yo, malse makkers!
Spelen en Timons.
Hey, stelletje kuthonden. Hoe gaat het met jullie allemaal? Bij mij gaat het echt 3 keer kut. Dan lijkt hij net krankenaria hier buiten, jongens. Toch, jongens? Het is net krankenaria hier buiten. Of niet, jongens? En dan niet alleen... What the fuck? What the fuck is dat? Dankjewel, Hopel. En dat niet alleen...
Misschien is een zak over je hoofd een idee.
Ik moet er nog Harry Potter voorlezen. En dat is nog niet eens het ergste, het allerergste. Ik heb verloren van Peter, dit is een strafstream. Met Sonic en speedrun. Hierdoor moet ik dus Harry Potter voorlezen, 1 hoofdstuk. Dus ik dacht van, leuk, kijk, ik heb nog nooit gelezen dat boek. Peter heeft gevraagd aan me... Hey, welke taal moeten we doen? Ik zei, doe maar Nederlands gewoon. Zo!
10 punten voor
Goedemorgen, dat staat hard. Hufflepuff, kut op met je Hufflepuff. Dus nu is het in het Engels. Ik weet niet hoeveel bladzijden het eerste hoofdstuk is. Harder. Maar hopelijk is het gewoon met 10 bladzijden klaar. Maar ik weet dat Harry Potter is volgens mij echt een boek met... Oh, hier, 200 pagina's.
Misschien is een zak over je hoofd een idee.
Alweer 7 maanden Hanja.
Kappen met die kut aan, ja, het is al een klote avond. Maak het niet erger. Dankjewel, Jordi zonder H, Hopel, Stijntje. Kuroyashi met tier 3. Je bent echt een droomgozer. Magic. Dankjewel. Malse, Kimp. En wie is er nog meer binnengekomen? Het Rode Gevaar. En Krogix. Ik wil eigenlijk niet te lang wachten. Ik wil gewoon vanaf zijn. En als het echt 40... Kan een hoofdstuk 40 pagina's zijn? Lijkt me niet. Ik denk dat het maximaal 30 is. En dat in het Engels. Maar jullie kunnen niet pakken een bakje koffie erbij. Pak een lekker koekje erbij. En als je moe bent, ga alsjeblieft even als een balletje onder je dekens liggen. Dan kan je een lekker tukje doen. Jongens, ik ga beginnen. Bereid je voor op het beste streampje aller tijden. Even in de sfeer komen, jongens. Harry Potter en de Philosopher's Stone. Van J.K. Rowling. Pottermore.com. Oh man joh! Waarom staat dit zo
Je bent
hard?
mijn zoon niet meer. Groetjes mama.
Wedden van wel. Oké, dit ga ik allemaal skippen. Dit... Content. Er staat niet eens bij hoeveel pagina's. Oké. Ga lekker zitten, jongens. Engels, echt. Ik heb zo... Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. Of number... Ja. Zo. Of number 4 Private Drive. Ik dacht dat het een... We're proud to say that they were... Nou, wacht jongens, ik moet even opnieuw gaan. Even helemaal opnieuw. Ik zie hoe klein die letters zijn. Mag ik even gluren hoe lang een hoofdstuk is? Dan kan ik me mentaal voorbereiden. Dan moet ik ook even bepalen of ik het in een geinig stemmetje kan doen. Of is het zonder gluur? Kijk nou hoeveel het is. Nu al 1 pagina. Dit gaat echt een 24 uur stream worden zo. Oké, opnieuw jongens. Zonder gluur, oké, daar hou ik me aan. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious. Because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Ik snap nu al niks meer wat ik heb gelezen. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was beefy. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck. Although he did have a very large mustache. Ik ken hem uit de film. Is dat zijn oom? Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde. And had nearly twice the usual amount of neck. Grote nek. Onthoud dat, jongens. Dat kan later nog terugkomen. Which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over the garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursley...
Kut zelf op Timon 10 punten aftrek voor hun.
Jij moet opkutten perkamenten, stik er lekker in! Ik ben... Nou, oh, hier was ik, denk ik. De muziek is zo intens, alsof het zo prachtig is. Ik zet het even zachter. The Dursleys had everything they wanted. But they also had a secret. And their greatest fear was somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. About the Potters? Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretends she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as slayish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too.
Ben je nu een verhaal aan het voorlezen of een woordjesoefening aan het doen? Snelheid is.
Hé, maar hallo! Weet je hoe moeilijk dit geschreven is? Het ligt niet aan mij, het is gewoon een kutboek! Maar dat boek heeft gewoon wat duidelijker in grotere letters op zijn minst. De muziek lijkt net of het zo intens is. But they had never ever seen him. This boy was another good reason. Dankjewel, Dragor. Good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley. Wie is Dudley nou weer? They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. Oké, we hebben een samenvatting. We hebben Mr. en Mrs. Dursley. Eén heeft een grote nek, andere kleine nek. En iets met de Potter. De zus van de Potter was er iets van. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the doll. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the doll. Wat is dat?
Gaat goed hoor, Timon.
Ja, dankjewel. Ik heb het gevoel dat het lekker gaat. We zijn al halverwege 1 pagina. Grey. Nou, ik ga even. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the doll. Great Tuesday or story starts. Oké, nu gaat het beginnen. There was nothing about the
Kut op.
Jij opkutten, Dudley. Wie ben jij zelfs? Dat is gewoon een typo. Dit is een Dursley moet ervan gemaakt worden. Oké. Oh, fuck. Fuck, nu ben ik helemaal weg. Iets dat starts the story, daar was ik. Kut. Oké. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull grey Tuesday, our story starts. Oh ja, daar. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon happen all over the country. Nice. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work. And Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his... Wat is een Dudley? Hebben we het nu over die Dudley guys of niet? Oh, fuck. None of them noticed a large star... None noticed a large tawny owl fluttered past the window. Oh, nice. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley... Gaan we lekker onder dit liggen, ja. Gaan we lekker liggen, dan val je zo in slaap. Dus zometeen gaat het spannend worden. Dan komt Harry Potter.
Terug van vakantie en terugkomen in dit soort kwaliteit.
Dit is top. Ik geniet echt intens. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed.
Ik geloof in jou, Timon. Je komt hier doorheen.
Als je stopt met
Laat je
doneren,
niet afleiden,
gaat dat lukken
uurtje
misschien.
Team P.
Dankjewel, dat waardeer ik wel.
Bleke huid, gebrekkig Engels en geen leesvaardigheid. Jij gaat naar Zwadderig.
Nee! Ik ben niet Hufflepuff. Oh, hij miste zijn kus. Because Dudley was now having a tantrum. Hij heeft zo'n tantrum, jongens. Jullie kennen het wel, zo'n tantrum. And throwing his cereal at the walls. Little Tyke chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. Fuck. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar.
Had zo gehoopt op een snelle dood.
Gaat traag. Ik ben nog lang niet klaar, dus dat is ook nog een probleem.
Echt de laatste keer.
Nee, Bram. A cat reading a map for a second. Wat? Hij zag een... Lees ik het goed? Hij zag een kat die een map leest. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing in a corner of Private Drive. But there wasn't a map inside. Oké, niks aan de hand. What could he have been thinking of? It must be... Echt die muziek, jongen. Hij ziet een kat. Goedemorgen, doe normaal. It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back.
Wel goed lezen, hé, want één verkeerde komma of letter maakt van Jezus nog een ketter.
Ik weet niet eens wat je allemaal lult. Ik ben perfect aan het lezen.
Chat,
Beter kan het
laten we
niet.
proberen om te luisteren. Ik snap er nu al geen flikker van, dus daarom Hanja.
Hoe snap je het niet? Hij rijdt langs en hij ziet een kat. As Mr.
Ik
Dursley...
zit vandaag op de home trainer tot 12 uur 's nachts, dus van mij mag je wel meer lezen dan
Het
één
gaat lekker,
hoofdstukje.
maar het vliegt
Heerlijk.
ook, hè. Ik ben nog maar net bezig. Ik ben al best wel lang bezig en het voelt alsof ik maar 1 minuut bezig ben, bedoel ik.
Zeer mooi boek, maar een lak aan plaatjes. Dichtklappen,
Ja,
dat
kon
boek.
dat maar. Ik moet nog... Ik ben bijna bij het hoofd... Ik ben bijna hoofdstuk af. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Private Drive. No looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Ik weet niet wat hier weer even gebeurt. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day.
Misschien is een zak over je hoofd een idee.
Ik moest kloppen, want de bel doet het niet.
Dankjewel, burgemeester en Rijksoverheid. Uw toeslag voor komende maand. Dankjewel. Voor je sponsor. Of superchat is het superchat. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. Hij gaat nog iets zien. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he could not help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in a funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. Hoe kunnen mensen dit ooit gelezen hebben? Hoe kunnen mensen dit ooit afgelezen? Ze zijn helemaal gek in een koppie. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley... Waarom geven ze niet gewoon een naam in plaats van Mr. Dursley? Was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why? That man had to be older than he was. And wearing an emerald green cloak. Nee. The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mrs. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings car park. His mind back on drills. Kijk jongens, ik snap perfect wat hier gebeurt. Hij ziet mensen in cloaks. Vindt hij vreemd. Ergens ziet hij dit. Hij ziet het ergens. Dat moet je weten in ieder geval. We hebben 1 pagina gehad jongens. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He did not see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed at the owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl even at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime. When he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the bakers. He eyed them angrily. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly, too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. Oké, maar geinig. Ik moet hier de stemmetjes doen. Ik heb maar 2 geinige stemmetjes. Ik heb de... Oh ja, dat weet ik echt niet hoor. En ik heb de... Dus ik moet 2 mensen hoort die praten. Dus die ga ik dan hiervoor kiezen.
The Potters. That's right. That's what I heard.
Yes. There's so Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. Hey, Just Say Pro, dankjewel. He dashed back across the road, hurried to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. Echt, wat lees ik nou allemaal? Ik heb toch helemaal niets gehoord van Harry Potter nog? Heb ik iets gemist alweer? He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Durley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still worried that he walked straight into someone outside the door. 1 bladzijde. Boom! Ga goed zitten, jongens. Want nu gaat het spannend worden. Sorry, he grunted. Oh, je moet stemmen.
Hanja
Nee. Kappen. Opkutten, Pixels. Het is al zwaar genoeg voor me. Het is zwaar genoeg. Thijs, dankjewel voor de YouTube sponsor, droomgozer. Echt een mannetje ben jij. Sorry, he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet
Timon,
cloak.
je doet het geweldig.
Dankjewel.
Heb je ooit gedacht om een luisterboek
Ik ben
in te spreken?
Ik ben in te huren om een boek in te spreken. Dus al heb je een boek en je zoekt nog iemand die het wil inspreken. Ik sta er open voor. Daarom is het ook gewoon handig voor mij.
Misschien is een zak over je hoofd een idee.
Het is Harry, niet Harry.
Harney, toch? Harney. Voor mij zei ik dat de hele tijd al goed. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile. And he said in squeaky voice that made passers-by state...
Don't be sorry, my dear Sir Master. For nothing could be upset me today, Master. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last, Master. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating. Yes, this happy day.
And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried into his car and sent off home, hoping he was imagining these things, which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. Zo intens was dat. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted this morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around his eyes. Kst, 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 said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley had learned a new word. Shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally... Oh, is it nieuws? And finally... Mijn stemming zijn op. Ik ga het in mijn eigen stem doen. And finally birdwatchers everywhere have reported that the nations owl have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious, and now over to McGruffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owl tonight, Jim? Dat is een geintje. Oh, so. Well, Ted, said the weatherman. I don't know.
Goedenavond, mijn lekkere zakenmannen.
Goedenavond, je bent een beetje
Kleiner
laat.
dan 3.
Ga snel zitten, pak snel een bakje koffie erbij en geniet ervan, hoor. Want het gaat spannend worden. Let maar op. I don't know any about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks. But I can promise a wet night today. A wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain. Owls flying by daylight. Mysterious people with cloaks all over the place. And whispers and whisper and a whisper about Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear. Yes? You haven't heard from your sister lately, haven't you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Dankjewel, meneer Hooggeleid. Voor 35 maanden. Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and they were a lot of funny looking people in town today. Dus, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, you know, her lot. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mrs. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casual as he could, their son, he'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? Rijksoverheid, dankjewel voor je euromunt. I suppose, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard? What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harney. Nasty common name if you ask me. Oh yes, said Mr. Dursley. His heart sinking horribly.
Yes, I quite agree.
Dynamite, dankjewel voor het suppie. Vogelaar is ook weer terug daardoor, dankjewel. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mr. Dursley was in the bathroom. Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as thought it was waiting for someone.
Timon,
Something.
wat hebben jij en Peter graag in de koffie? En wat vind je van Senseo? Zelf ga ik lekker gewoon voor zwart hoor.
Zie ik eruit alsof ik koffie drink? Zie ik er zo uit? Dat dacht ik ook. Idiot. Was he imagining things? Could all this be... Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did... If it got out of... God, man. If it got out that they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. Next zegt met een superchat. Hoi, Timon en Potter. Oh ja, ik snap... Die snap ik. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly. But Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last conforming thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He could not see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It could not affect them, jongens. How very wrong was he? He was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It did not so much as quiver when a car door slammed in the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. So. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently you'd have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Oh fuck. Nothing like this man had ever been in Privet Drive. Hoe weet een kat dit nou, man? Ik word helemaal Dit gaat nog zo lang duren. He was tall, thin and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright and sparkling behind a half moon. Spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked. Very long. As thought it had been spoken at least twice, this man's name was Albus Dumbledore! Nice! Dumbledore! Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a seat where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy, rummaging in his cloak looking for something. Wow. Ik moet even een slokje pauze, jongens. Even heftig. Dumbledore zit nu in het verhaal, jongens. Dumbledore. Slokje genomen allemaal. But he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered. Is mutters toch mompelen? He had found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it over. Sound effects. Held it up in the air and clicked it. Oh, hier moet die sound effect. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put outer until the only light left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of the window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and sent off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke.
Fancy seeing you here, mate. Professor
McGonagall. He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the shape of the markings of the cat had around his eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled.
How did you know it was me?
She asked.
My dear
Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly. You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day, said Professor McGonagall. All day? When you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here. Oh, fuck. Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. Oh, yes! Everyone celebrating all right? She said impatiently. You think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on the news. She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. I heard it! Flocks of owls shooting stars. Well, they are not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I'll bet it was Daedalus Diggle. He never had much sense. Fuck. You can't blame them, said Dumbledore gently. We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. I know that, said Professor McGonagall, geïrriteerd. But that's no reason to lose your heads. People are being downright careless. Out on the streets in broad daylight. Not even dressed in muggle clothes. Swapping rumors. She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore. As though hoping he was going to tell her something. But he didn't. So she went on. A fine thing it would be if on the very day you know who seems to have disappeared at last, the muggles found about us all. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore. Die zin hier, er komt mijn naam. It certainly seems so, said Dumbledore. who had much to be thankful for. Would you care for a sherbet lemon? A what? A sherbet lemon! They're kind of muggle sweet. I'm rather fond of it. No thanks, said Professor McGonagall, coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for a sherbet lemon. As I say, even if you know who has gone... Come on, man. My dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you know who nonsense for 11 years. I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name. Voldemort! Ooh! Professor McGonagall flinched. But Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 sherbet lemons, seemed not to notice. It all gets so confusing if you keep saying who you know who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort. Voldemort's name. Whoa. I know you haven't, said Mr. McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one, you know. Oh, alright, Voldemort was frightened of. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort had powers I will never have. Only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, the owls are nothing to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying? About why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him? It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss. The real reason she had been waiting on a cold hard wall all day. For neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another sherbet lemon, and did not answer. What they're saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James, I can't believe it. I did not want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all, folks. They're saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Arnie. But he could not. He could not kill the little boy. No one knows why or how. But they're saying that when he could not kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke. And that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly. Zoals hij wel vaker doet. It's true? Faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all the people he's killed, he could not even kill a little boy? It's just astounding, of all things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harney survive? Zo. En er is nog geen einde in zicht voor het eerste hoofdstuk, jongens. Ik weet dat het even spannend is, maar even een slokje hier tussendoor. Ik kan echt niet wachten hoe dit eindigt, namelijk. We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McCarkle pulled out a lace handkerchief. Jullie kennen het wel, zo'n lace handkerchief. And dabbed. McCarkle plucked the handkerchiefs and dabbed her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands, but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around on the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way.
Yes,
said Professor Garkle. And I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places.
I've come to bring Harney to his aunt and uncle.
They're the only family he has left now. You don't mean... You can't mean the people who live here? Cried Professor Garkle, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't! I've been watching them all day. You could not find 2 people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here. Dat snap ik niet. It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor Garkle faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore? You think you can explain them this all in a letter? These people will never understand him. He will be famous, a legend. I would not be surprised if today was known Harry Potter Day. I would not be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harney. Every child in our world will know his name.
exactly,
said Dumbledore, looking very serious over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. You can't see how much better off he will be growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it. Professor Cockle opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed and said, Yes. Yes, Master, you are right. Of course. But how is the boy getting here? Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak, suddenly as though he might be hiding Harney underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it's wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Mr. McCarkle, grudgingly, but you can't pretend he's not careless. He does stand to... What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign. Ja, wat is hem?
Heb jij die alerts stilgezet? Zodat je niet lastig gevallen wordt?
Heb ik ze stilgezet? Volgens mij niet. Er is gewoon niemand binnengekomen, toch? Peter, ik zit helemaal niet in het verhaal.
Ik vind het heel erg apart.
Oké, ik zal ze even... staan aan hoor. Wie heb ik op? Ik zal ze wel even terug doen voor jou. Dit is 8 minuten hè. Oh jee, ik ben echt heel veel gemist. Sorry jongens, ik ga het even repeaten. Ik ga ze gewoon repeaten. Hier kan ik ze, of kan ik ze daar... Ik ga ze repeaten jongens. Peter is echt helemaal eruit hoor. Oké, gaat even eerst alles even repeaten. Emma die heeft een suppie gegeven aan... Ik kan het niet repeaten, ik ga het gewoon voorlezen. Emma heeft een suppie gegeven aan Pompfiets. Dankjewel, droomgozer. Bansi Pansy. Yes, Timon, I think you're doing great work. Such a relaxing stem. Dankjewel, Bassie Passie. Voor 8 maanden. Bram Bozelo Zozolo. Voor 10 maandjes, dankjewel. Mr. Gargoyle is trots op je, Team Monk. Zet hem op, zegt Bibrofi. Slappeman Slappelul, die geeft een 3 euro donatie. Die zegt, wat een zwoele stem en een perfecte vloeiende uitspraak. En zo'n lekker tempo. Met veel inleving en emotie. Ga verder. En stop alsjeblieft niet. Ja, ik had niet gestopt als lacht aan Peter. Ik hang aan je lippen. Het lijkt al alsof het hier kankernaria is. Daar ben ik het wel mee eens. Lodeborn is voor 2 maanden gesubt. Hier, mijn stuurvrienden Neopets. Dubloenen of zo. Dankjewel voor de 2 maandjes. En Rickleys na 8 maanden zegt... Timon, je hebt een heerlijke voorleesstem. Nu weet ik waarom ik jullie geld geef. Heb je het eindelijk door. Tijdje geleden dat ik er echt bij was. Maar toch wel genieten hoor. Zet hem op, Timo. Dankjewel, Jolige Joop. Hopelijk doen nu alle donaties gewoon weer met geluid. En donaties en subs. Ik ben er wel helemaal uit. Maar ik ga weer verder, jongens. Waar was ik? Hier denk ik dan. Ik ga wel gewoon hier. A low rumbling sound had broken the silence. Dat is laag. Want ik had het al gelezen dat het een motor werd. It grew steadily louder as they looked down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to roar as they both looked at the sky. And a huge motorbike out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorbike was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as the normal man. And at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed. And so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of a dustbin. Lids and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his fast, muscular arms, he was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore. Sound. Dus dan alweer.
Kennen jullie deze nog?
Het werkt weer.
Het werkt weer. Oké, dankjewel. Pieterman, wegwezen.
Krijg je.
Wat was het? Peter, ophoepelen! Hagrid, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. At last. And where did you get that motorbike? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing careful of the motorbike as he spoke. Young Sirius Black landed to me. No problem. Oh. Young Sirius Black landed to me. I've got him, sir. No problems were there?
Misschien is een zak over
No, master.
een idee.
Pizza Koe, dankjewel voor de 7 maanden. No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out. All right before the muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we were flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McCarkle bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a boy. A baby boy.
Misschien is een zak
Fast
over
asleep.
een idee.
Emma, the cutie man, dankjewel. Was a fast baby boy fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet black hair over his forehead. They could see a curious shaped cut like a bot. Litteken, jongens. Is that where? Whispered Professor Gargoyle. Yes, said Dumbledore. He will have that scar forever. Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Even I could. If I wouldn't... Even if I could, I would not. Scars can come in useful. I've won myself above my left knee, which is a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned towards the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir? Asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harney and gave him what must be been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. Then suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. Kst! Hissed Professor Karkle. You wake the muggles! Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. But I can't stand it. Lily and James' death. And that. And poor little Harney after live with muggles. Yes, it's all very sad, master. But get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we will be found. Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harney gently on the doorstep, took a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harney's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at a little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor Karkle blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. Well, said Dumbledore finally, that's that. We have no business staying here. We may as well go join the celebrations. Yeah, said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. I'd best get this bike away. Good night, Professor Karkle. Professor Dumbledore, sir, wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve. Hagrid swung himself on the motorbike and kicked the engine into life. With a roar it rose to the air and flight into the night.
Te spannend.
Ja, het is erg spannend. We zijn er bijna wel echt, het is even doorgaan. Het is wel erg spannend. Het gaat nog spannender worden, denk ik ook. I shall see you guys soon. I expect Professor McGonagall said. I shall see you soon. I expect Professor McGonagall said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner he stopped and took out a silver put-outer. He clicked it once and 12 balls of light sped back to their street lamps so that Privet Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. Good luck, Harney, he murmured. He turned his head. He turned on his heel. He turned on his heel, and with a swish of his cloak, he was gone. Woof. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky. The very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him and he slept on. Not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles. Nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He could not know that at this very moment, people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices to Harry Potter, the boy who lived. Jongens. Jongens. Yes! Yes! Het is me gelukt, jongens. We hebben het allemaal overleefd. We hebben het allemaal overleefd. Het was spannend, het is klaar. Oi, oi, oi. Ik heb precies... Even kijken, hoeveel bladzijden heb ik gelezen? Ik heb 10 bladzijden gelezen. Ik heb er een uur over gedaan. Maar we hebben het overleefd, jongens. Hand op je hart en zing mee. Oi, oi, oi. Dit is wel het beste streampje die we al ooit hebben gehad, jongens. En wat was dit? Ik vond het niet eens een straf. Ik vond het leuk. Ik wil bijna nog een hoofdstuk... Bijna nog een hoofdstuk doen. Ik ga nog een hoofdstuk doen. Ik ga nog een hoofdstuk doen. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Glass. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on the front step. But Private Drive